picture of innocence which broke our hearts.
Two girls with futures, with hopes and dreams that have been shattered by this predatory man.
A man they trusted.
It doesn't help the fact that I was one of the last people to speak to them. The last bit in that conversation and thinking perhaps something different could have been said.
Revealed as a monster.
I think he's certainly one of the most dangerous and notorious child killers that we've ever come across in this country.
Two little girls missing from home.
Anyone who's got children must know what we're going through.
A huge search, but a killer hiding in plain sight.
They just seemed like normal, happy kids.
It is quite chilling to think that you've talked to a murderer without knowing he was a murderer.
Tonight, the damning first-hand accounts that reveal the secrets of Huntley's past.
He sexually assaulted me and then threw me downstairs.
Got me by the throat and said, if you spoil this for me, I'll kill you.
And the daughter, who never knew the truth about her father.
He will never deserve to be called Dad.
How Huntley managed to escape justice.
He was like Teflon Man. Nothing ever stuck to him.
Had he just been convicted of my burglary, it would have stopped all that. It wouldn't have gone any further.
The crucial failings that let him get a job close to children.
It was criminal in some ways that there should have been such a low threshold of security checks.
And the people who helped finally put him behind bars.
It's like a jigsaw puzzle. You get another bit of the jigsaw puzzle, another bit of the jigsaw puzzle, and eventually you get the picture.
15 years on, the saddest of stories, the most brutal of murders, and the most evil of men.
I hope it's hell for him for the rest of his days.
Soham in Cambridgeshire, a quintessential English market town, but a place that would become synonymous with the most appalling of crimes. August 2002, a normal Sunday evening. 10-year-old best friends Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman were enjoying a summer barbecue at Holly's house. They would leave to buy some sweets, but would never come home.
The fascination of Soham was that it was that typical little English village or town in the middle of a peaceful summer where this terrible drama unfolds. A drama where two pretty little girls whose pictures are seen everywhere, go missing, and that every parent in the country knows it's their worst nightmare.
Most of the literally thousands of reports of missing children every year are resolved successfully, and the kids are just somewhere, stayed out late in the park or gone somewhere where they shouldn't have gone and not come to any harm. While you're always aware of the possibility that it could be one that ends badly or where there's been a serious crime committed, the assumption is actually it will turn out okay.
By nightfall on August the 4th, there was still no sign of the girls. The following morning, the search continued. A press conference was arranged by police with both sets of parents.
Their disappearance is incredibly out of character. They haven't been missing before. Very well balanced, very bright young girls. As far as we can tell, they've taken no change of clothing and no money. So as we say, it's quite out of character.
Holly and Jessica were born in Soham within a month of each other. They first met at nursery when they were just 4 years old and immediately struck up a close friendship. They both idolised David Beckham and supported Manchester United. Just 3.5 hours before they were reported missing, Holly's mum Nicola took this photograph. A picture of two happy little girls, which would later become a heartbreaking image, seared into the public consciousness. Their disappearance was front-page news. The media descended on Soham. One of Britain's best-known news presenters, Jeremy Thompson, was soon assigned to the town, and then played a crucial role in the whole story.
Somehow I think those cute faces staring out from the front pages of the papers and from TV channels just hooked people. It traumatized people. I think they thought, no, this can't happen in a place like this on a beautiful summer's afternoon. Surely there's got to be a good outcome. Surely they're going to be found safe. Surely they can't have come to any harm. And there was that riveting, compelling feeling that everybody was just willing it to turn out okay.
Nicky Gerard studied the case and wrote a detailed account of the crime.
It was almost too perfect an image. The fact that they were little girls and they were happy and one was blonde and one was dark. It has such traction, that kind of image. It's like an image of kind of beaming, ordinary innocence.
The tight-knit community came out in force to try and find the missing school friends.
I think it's just this feeling that you can't stay at home. You want to come out and help and try and do something.
Hundreds of volunteers joined the police in the search. Former Murder Squad detective Colin Sutton has run many missing person inquiries.
Previously, it would have been speaking to people who are known to them, see if they're at their house, and looking around at footpaths and parks. Once that fails, we need to do a systematic search of everywhere around, from there outwards in a kind of a spiral. And I think that's the stage where the searching officers start speaking to people like Ian Huntley.
28-year-old Huntley was the caretaker of the local secondary school. He moved to Soham the previous year. Huntley joined the rest of the town to look for Holly and Jessica. At this stage, he was also thought to be a crucial witness, the last person to see the girls. Huntley gave this interview to Channel 5 News during the search. His words, now chilling.
It doesn't help the fact that I was one of the last people to speak to them, if not the last person to speak to them. I keep reliving that conversation and thinking perhaps something different could have been said, perhaps kept them here a little bit longer, maybe changed events.
And of course, at the time, it was just a normal chat with two girls that you knew.
Well, that's just it, I didn't even know them.
Huntley's partner, Maxine Carr, was a teaching assistant at Holly and Jessica's school and would eventually provide him with a false alibi. To the people of Soham, desperately searching for the girls, there seemed no reason to suspect Huntley. They had no knowledge of his deeply disturbing past. In nearby Lakenheath, Ron Cowper is the landlord of the village pub, where Huntley's dad Kevin worked as a barman.
Ian was just a customer who came in when his father worked for us. He used to pop in and see him and have a drink, and he did chat one of the barmaids up and took her out one night.
A few weeks before Holly and Jessica's disappearance, glazing contractor Benjamin Hickling met Huntley when he visited Soham Village College to discuss some maintenance work. At the time, Huntley seemed completely normal.
Our contact name was given as Ian Huntley. We walked around for 10-15 minutes talking about normal life, and seemed like a likeable guy, very, very talkative.
We'd seen Huntley around the village college. He lived in a tied cottage right on the green, right in front of the college, and he was around every day. I met a lot of my colleagues would say hello to him every morning. He was a regular there.
The people of Soham were unaware a killer had been living in their midst. But as the search continued, Holly and Jessica's parents were beginning to fear the worst for their girls.
Friends and family searching in ditches, in rivers, looking for shallow graves for our children.
In cases of abduction where a stranger's involved, statistically we know that once you move into sort of about a 72-hour period, then the vast majority of children aren't going to be found alive after that, particularly if the abductor is a stranger to the family. You always have that in the back of your mind when you're doing the investigation.
From the outset, we thought this might have been a prank, then we thought there might have been an accident, but now we're sadly having to consider the possibility of an abduction. As each day, each hour passes, our concerns for the safety of Holly and Jessica increases.
Obviously, we love them so much. We just want them to know. Just anyone who's got children must know what we're going through.
As the people of Soham prayed for Holly and Jessica's return, CCTV footage had come to light of them in the car park of the local sports centre on their way to buy sweets. Detective Superintendent David Hankins, the officer leading the inquiry, hoped that releasing the footage would lead to a breakthrough.
Well, they walk down here and then they go into the car park of the sports centre. They look as though they're enjoying themselves, perfectly normal, nothing untoward.
To help jog people's memories, a reconstruction of the girls' last known movements was also staged. More than 2,000 potential sightings came in.
You could sense that the police were almost overwhelmed, and so were we, because we were getting some of these leads handed on to us, that the two little girls have been seen in the back of a van, they've been seen in a car, they've been seen in a taxi.
11 days after Holly and Jessica vanished, Huntley gave an interview to Sky News presenter Jeremy Thompson, which would become infamous.
How do we know they were here at 6:15? Well, we have an eyewitness. Ian Huntley here is a familiar figure. Evening, Ian. You're the school caretaker. The girls, Jessica and Holly, would know you, and they saw you on the front doorstep. What went on?
Well, I don't know the girls. I was stood on the front doorstep grooming my dog down. She'd run away and come back a bit of a mess. They just came across and asked how Miss Carr was, as she used to teach them at St Andrews. I just said she weren't very good, as she hadn't got the job. And they just says, please tell her that we're very sorry. And off they walked in the direction of the library over there.
He looked me in the eye during the interview. He didn't keep looking away like you might expect of somebody who was guilty or thought they were guilty. And you may, as it turned out, have been the last person to actually chat to them before they vanished.
Yeah, that's what it seems like.
And it's a mystery
Absolutely,
still not solved.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nobody was nudging me and saying, he's the one, ask him if he did it. If I thought he had, I would have asked him, did you kill those two girls? But I didn't, because he didn't seem that suspicious. I carry on walking around where the girls are supposed to have gone. I was to find out not long afterwards they'd gone nowhere near there. They'd been dragged in through his front door and killed in his bathroom. And there was nothing that Sunday evening that gave you a glimmer of suspicion that anything was wrong?
No, not at all.
It is quite chilling to think that you've talked to a murderer without knowing he was a murderer.
But Huntley, the trusted caretaker who seemed as desperate as anyone for Holly and Jessica to be found, would soon be unmasked. Ten-year-old Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman hadn't been seen for 11 days since they vanished from a family barbecue. Ian Huntley, caretaker of the local college, had emerged as a key witness.
And you may, as it turned out, have been the last person to actually chat to them before they vanished.
Yeah, that's what it seems like.
Huntley's partner, Maxine Carr, was a teaching assistant at their school.
You knew the girls. What were they like? Tell us a bit about them.
This is something I'll probably keep for the rest of my life, I think. It's what Holly gave me on the last day of term. She was very, very upset because I didn't get my job. And she just gave me this with a poem on the inside saying to a special teaching assistant, really. And we'll miss her a lot and we'll see her in the future.
Clearly, Maxine Carr was very touched by this card. She talked about what nice little girls they were, and particularly what a nice little girl Holly was, and how nice it was that she'd made this card for her. And she said, and that was the sort of little girl she was.
She was just lovely, really lovely.
That's really very sweet, isn't it?
Yeah.
My two producers, Ed and Kate, said, it's a bit strange, talking about Holly in the past tense like that. We all agree, went, yeah, that was strange. Maybe it's something we should mention to the police. Maybe it is significant.
By now, Cambridgeshire police were also increasingly suspicious of Huntley and Carr. The last signal emitted by Jessica's mobile phone placed the girls very close to the couple's house on the evening they vanished. Detectives also started to receive more information on previous allegations about Huntley before he'd moved to Soham. The couple were taken to separate police stations for hours of detailed questioning.
Which direction did the girls actually walk off in?
They headed off to my left, which would, if they stayed on the path, take them to the direction of the library.
He was the last person to see the girls alive. He was volunteered that information and that status. Once you start looking at it as a potential crime, then you start from the last sighting and work your way outwards.
Maxine Carr provided Huntley with an alibi. She claimed she was at home with him on the day Holly and Jessica vanished.
It's caught about 1:15 when we took the dog out.
And is that a normal thing that he would do after dinner on a Sunday?
It is when I want him out the way.
And did you want him out that way?
Yeah, because I wanted to get on with the flaming pots and the housework and everything.
Huntley and Carr were released, but their story was beginning to unravel. Witnesses had come forward to say she had been seen in Grimsby during the period she claimed to be home in Soham. Police conducted a search of the college where Huntley worked. In the boiler room, they made a grim discovery. The football shirts Holly and Jessica had been wearing when they vanished had been found. They'd been set alight and dumped in a bin.
That was when the police realised that they had got the right man in their eyes. And although they didn't come out and confirm it in such bold terms at a news conference, we were getting enough behind the scenes to know that they were pretty certain that they got the right man.
Within hours, Huntley and Carr were arrested.
A big moment for the team that they've finally been able to bring the investigation to an arrest, and not just a speculative arrest, but an arrest with real forensic evidence in the background and, you know, a really good chance that this is the man that did it.
Later that day, as police were consulting forensic experts about where Huntley might have hidden Holly and Jessica, the dreadful news everyone feared came through and was caught on camera.
Seriously, I need to interrupt, I'm sorry. We had finding in Brandon 2 bodies. I'm never public. Brandon's a very significant officer.
I think events have taken over, I was going to say.
2 bodies had been discovered by a gamekeeper in fields next to RAF Laken Heath, 13 miles from Soham. It was August the 17th, 13 days after Holly and Jessica had gone missing.
It may be some days yet before we are able to positively identify the 2 bodies found at Common Drove near Laken Heath in Suffolk yesterday lunchtime.
When bodies are found, it's a very necessary step in the investigation in some ways, but that's tempered by the fact that it finally means you know that this has been, a fatal case rather than the case that these 2 young girls would still be found alive.
The discovery of the bodies near the airbase led some of those who knew Huntley to come forward as witnesses. Glazing contractor Benjamin Hickling remembered him talking about RAF Laken Heath when they'd met just a few weeks earlier.
He said that there's a very special place that he goes down, a private lane where no one ever goes down. Thought nothing of it until later on the television when we heard that some girls had been found in a place very, very similar to what he described.
As Holly and Jessica's parents waited for the dreadful confirmation the remains were those of their daughters, the community of Soham was already in mourning.
The whole town feels in some way violated by the disappearance of Jessica and Holly.
You just sense these poor families who finally knew the worst, and it was now a murder case with 2 bodies and 2 dead little girls.
Prime suspect Ian Huntley was in custody, and the police were confident he was guilty of Holly and Jessica's abduction and murder. But without a confession, they needed more evidence. Investigators also needed to connect Huntley to the location where the bodies were found, so called in forensic ecologist Professor Patricia Wiltshire. She specialises in matching samples from a crime scene with items belonging to the suspect.
And I could see footprints going down, and I took my samples and I used those samples, call them comparator samples, as a template so that I could get the biological profile of the whole place. Once I have the profile of species from the pollen grains and from the plant spores, I can then compare that profile with any profile we get from the vehicle, from the car, and from shoes or anything else that, that the offender might have worn or used in this site.
She also discovered evidence linking this location with the burned football shirts that had been found where Huntley worked.
There were lots of plant fragments on the girls' clothes, but particularly lots of these. These are the little fruiting heads of the alder tree, female fruiting heads that contain seeds. They're sort of prickly and catch on things, and they were caught in the fabric of the girls' clothes.
These samples would later prove crucial during Huntley's trial. But body language expert India Ford thinks there were other clues to Huntley's guilt during his now notorious television interview.
And you may, as it turned out, have been the last person to actually chat to them before they vanished.
Yeah, that's what it seems like.
On the surface, everything looks pretty innocent. But when you start to scratch the veneer of his very, very polished performance, you start to notice some red flags appearing. He immediately put his hands behind his back as soon as he started answering the questions. When we're in a state of stress, the hands are the first thing that jump into action.
Confident in his ability to disguise his guilt before his arrest, Huntley seemed to court the media.
Now, there was a meeting here last night, obviously. How do you think the community's coping with all this?
Overall, I think they're coping quite well. The overall view seems to be, while there's no news, there's still a glimmer of hope. And I'd go along with that.
You think, why on earth is he doing this? Yeah, he's the person who's committed this crime. Surely this is just going to draw more attention to him. But that's what he wants. He wants attention. And it's giving him a sense of power, because out of all of these people who are looking for these 2 little girls, he's the only one that knows what happened to them. And that really does give him the upper hand.
But now, everything had changed. Huntley was about to be charged with Holly and Jessica's murder. During police questioning, his formerly confident demeanour had completely disappeared.
Can you give me your full name and address, please?
Ian Huntley, College Close, so.
Looking at his gestures, the leg shaking and the hand shaking and the hunched posture would all point to, I'm unstable. I didn't know what I was doing. I actually don't know what I'm doing now. I can't hear you very well. Look at me, I can't even control my leg. I can't control my hands. Basically, he wants sympathy.
He put on a really reasonable act of being very mentally ill. He would sit in interviews with the police and put on dribbling and staring at space. So much so that he was actually committed to a secure hospital at Rampton and assessed as to his mental health before he could stand trial.
It wasn't in the slightest bit surprising that Ian Huntley would try and pass himself off as crazy, but he might have a screw loose somewhere, but he certainly knew what he was doing to those 2 little girls in cold blood.
Huntley was about to stand trial, yet he would invent the most bizarre story to try to escape justice. And 15 years on, the ghosts of Huntley's past still haunt those who say he should have been behind bars years before. Ian Kevin Huntley was born in 1974 and grew up in an ordinary working-class household in Grimsby, north-east Lincolnshire. He was the eldest of 2 boys, but had problems fitting in with his classmates at school.
Because he was bullied, he moved secondary schools. There was quite a lot of upheaval around that. When we have young people who lack control over their lives as children, that often becomes an intense need to be in control when they're older. So we've got the seeds being sown here for somebody who is always trying to get control back, always trying to get the upper hand.
After leaving school, Huntley worked at a food processing plant where he met an 18-year-old woman who he married within just a few months. She later had an abortion after claiming Huntley threatened to harm the baby if she had it. She would also claim Huntley's need for control was constant.
He restricted her food. He took control of her bank accounts. She had quite long flowing hair and he said to her, "You've got to cut it." So after that superficial charm had faded, after he'd got this woman where he wanted her, the real him started to come to life.
It was a pattern of behaviour that would define most of Huntley's relationships: dominance, threats, and violence. Huntley also had a series of relationships with younger girls. Emma Fish was one of them. This is her first television interview.
I was 15 years old when I met Ian. He kind of swept me off my feet and made me feel safe at first. And he was a handsome guy.
Emma says she moved in with Huntley and later fell pregnant.
I told him I was pregnant. I'd done a pregnancy test and he didn't take it very well. So he got me by the throat up a wall because he'd started seeing somebody else at this point. Got me by the throat and said, "If you spoil this for me, I'll kill you."
Emma says she went on to have a miscarriage.
You don't know, do you? You're a child yourself. This is a man that's been on the planet a little bit longer than you have. He's done more things than you have. You haven't lived your life yet. What sort of a normal 22-year-old man hangs around with children? It's all about power, for definite. The only reason that man went with kids is for the power trip.
Social services looked into several complaints of underage sex against Huntley.
Well, several people did flag up concerns about Huntley's relationships with underage girls, so that the parents of some of the girls and other concerned adults reported him to the police and to social services. But they often didn't follow this through because the girls would not press any kind of charges. They'd refuse to comply with the investigation because they were very much under his spell.
He was also reported to police over claims of indecent assault and 4 counts of rape. But despite once being charged with rape, the case was dropped. So Huntley had no convictions. But by November 2003, when he stood trial for the murders of Holly and Jessica, time was running out for him. The evidence was compelling. Ian Huntley's trial opened at the Old Bailey. Maxine Carr was also in the dock, accused of perverting the course of justice. By now, she'd admitted lying for him. She'd said it was because she believed he was innocent, but later insisted she was effectively forced into it. The Wells and Chapman families had waited 15 months to find out what really happened to their girls.
They were immensely dignified. They had been through hell, and they looked like they had been through hell.
Standing in court, this was the first time Huntley and Carr had been together since they were charged.
They stood side by side in the court, but they didn't look at each other. They looked straight ahead.
The couple's relationship had started nearly 5 years earlier, when they met on a night out in Grimsby.
She appeared to be younger than she was, and it made her quite vulnerable. She was somebody who was quite susceptible to someone like Huntley, who wanted to feel superior, who wanted to feel in control.
Huntley and Carr moved in together after dating for just a few weeks. But more claims about the dark side of his personality later emerged.
Neighbours reported hearing quite violent physical confrontations between them, and it wouldn't surprise me if Huntley had preyed on Maxine's vulnerabilities.
Women find it very difficult to get out of these relationships because being in them wears down their self-esteem, so they feel absolutely worthless. And they get into an addictive cycle where they're put down and they feel awful, but the person who is able to comfort them is the perpetrator who's causing them the violence. It's a very difficult cycle to break out of, and women need a lot of support to get out of that cycle.
In November 2001, when Huntley got the job as caretaker of Soham Village College in Cambridgeshire, Maxine moved south with him and into the house that came with the job. For a time, all seemed to be going well.
At this point in time, he's learned quite a lot of skills in terms of how to be charming, how to make a good first impression. So he presents himself as a family man who has a fiancée and they want to settle down, and this is an area where they'd like to do that. So it's that veneer of respectability, that facade of normality that he's so good at performing.
That facade of apparent normality hid the real character of a killer. During the trial, the prosecution argued Huntley had killed Holly and Jessica in his house on the day they disappeared, drove to a carefully chosen spot down a country track, and hid their bodies in a ditch. 4 days later, while the rest of Soham was still searching and hoping for their safe return, he went back to the ditch, doused the bodies in petrol, and started a fire to hide what he'd done. But Huntley denied murder. He said the girls died accidentally.
It's an absolutely bizarre and fanciful defence that he came up with, saying that Holly had had a nosebleed, and in trying to help her, she'd slipped into the bath and drowned, and then he accidentally suffocated Jessica while trying to stifle her screaming with a pillow. I mean, to come up with that as being a better version of whatever he did just shows the mark of the man, really.
He did say that he had killed them, but he said he'd killed them by mistake. And there was a way in which he probably believed that, because he couldn't connect the way he thought about himself with the actions he'd done. So he was utterly lacking in insight, lacking in guilt. He felt sorry for himself that he had done this thing which was then going to ruin his life.
The evidence gathered by forensic ecologist Professor Patricia Wiltshire had linked Huntley's car to the ditch where the girls' bodies were found.
He had a lot of forethought because he had changed the tyres. They were new. He had cleaned the car, he thought, from top to bottom. He had not touched the chassis. When I had it hoisted up, I got masses of soil from underneath the chassis that was full of pollen and trace evidence. And then, of course, the footwells and the foot pedals. So there was an awful lot of pollen grains and spores that were also in the soil at the crime scene and towards the entry of the ditch.
Other forensic evidence, hairs and fingerprints, linked Huntley to the charred remains of the girls' red football shirts that had been discovered in a locked hangar at the school. Benjamin Hickling gave evidence at the Old Bailey. He revealed Huntley's prior knowledge of RAF Lakenheath, where the bodies were found.
We were walking through the playground, going from one building to another, and a fighter jet, a US fighter jet, went flying over our heads. His words to me were, "This is why I moved down to Soham, because he wanted to be close to RAF Lakenheath." He said that he goes down there with his girlfriend often and sits and watches the aeroplanes take off. When I finished the evidence, whilst walking out the court, I had to walk straight past Ian Huntley, and I looked at him and he looked at me, and I think he was trying to say to me, "You have just dropped me right in it."
Also built into the prosecution case were Jeremy Thompson's now infamous television interviews with Huntley and Carr.
I was called to stand in the witness box, and it was a very strange sensation. I've never done that before. And I must say, I looked down at Huntley, who'd looked me in the eyes 16 months before when we did that interview on television, and this time he was looking really shifty. He wouldn't make eye contact at all in court. He was just scribbling a notebook, and next to him, Maxine Carr was just fiddling with her fingers. They wouldn't look at me, and I was determined to sort of see if I could get their attention, see what I could read into their eyes, but they kept their head down.
As the trial progressed, details would emerge of the true nature of the man charged with double murder.
There was a really strange little kind of glimpse into his character towards the end of the trial when he was describing what he'd done. And he was talking about how he'd taken off these shoes he'd just bought before he went to dispose of their bodies because they were new shoes and he didn't want to mark them. And I remember feeling this kind of lurch of horror at that, because he had these two little girls who he'd killed and he was worrying about ruining his new shoes because he was rather proud of them. He clearly had no empathy.
On the 17th of December 2003, Ian Huntley was found guilty on both counts of murder. As he was driven away to start 2 life sentences, questions remained.
Only he knows why he murdered Jessica and Holly. Perhaps one day he might demonstrate some sliver of humanity and explain why he did what he did that terrible day last August.
Police officers like winning cases, of course they do. But when you have convicted somebody who you know presents an absolute danger to vulnerable people in society, and you have taken him off the streets and he can't be a danger anymore, it's the greatest feeling on earth.
Maxine Carr was given 3.5 years for conspiring to pervert the course of justice, but was cleared of assisting an offender.
I thought she was rather a sad little figure that just got caught up in something awful that she could probably have never suspected or envisaged, but then we don't know what went on behind the doors of his cottage next to the village college.
Maxine Carr's a victim of Ian Huntley to a degree, and she has to live with what she did, but I think she's paid a high price for that in terms of the effect it's had on her life. And at the end of the day, that wouldn't have happened to her had it not been for Ian Huntley.
Please don't give me this crap that Maxine Carr was a victim of this. She gave an alibi that meant the police lost day after day after day in this hunt and made it even worse for the parents. I have absolutely not a shred of sympathy for this one.
Justice had been done, but with Huntley behind bars, there were secrets still to be revealed. 15 years on, this family would provide another insight into his warped mind. And this teenager would discover that her father was one of Britain's most evil men. Ian Huntley is currently serving a minimum of 40 years in prison for the murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. Much of his dark past had emerged after the trial, but there were still secrets to be told. And 15 years on, these 3 women provide a key link to the man who would become one of Britain's most notorious killers. In the 90s, Huntley was living on Humberside, selling lottery tickets for a charity with Jackie Edwards.
We used to talk about what he did, and he lived in this flat and he didn't have no family about and things like that, and he hadn't had proper meals. So after he'd been working with me for a while, I invited him back for Sunday dinner because I felt sorry for him.
While working with Jackie, he met her teenage daughter, Katie.
Well, I thought he was nice. He was polite, took an interest, which was appealing at the time. I was only 15.
They say the first date was an unsettling sign of things to come.
He was going into town and he wanted to take Katie into town. And I said, yeah, but I want her back by tea time for a tea. I says, and you can come back and have some tea with us. He says, yeah, okay, no problem. Never came back.
I just remember waking up in the morning, but I had no clothes on. He said I'd been sick down the dress, he had to take it off and wash it. My mum and dad come round, it must have been the Sunday morning, but he'd locked me in the flat upstairs and said that he would go and see them and sort things out. At the time, I didn't think anything of it.
Despite being only 15, Katie moved in with Ian.
The police went round to see him, and they come back to see me, and they said that she was 15. If they fetched her home, she'd only run away again. There was nothing they could really do.
I didn't want to stay in the flat. When he went out, I asked to go with him, and we got into an argument, and that's when he first lashed out at me. He was crying and said he was sorry and it'd never happen again, and he's never done anything like that before.
The pair moved to Immingham, but Katie says Huntley's violence soon escalated.
We went and stopped with his mum for a little bit. That's when it really started to change. His mum's girlfriend, Julie, she used to taunt me when he went out, saying that he was with all these different girls. I questioned him about that, and he didn't like it. And that was the first time he raped me.
Katie claims Huntley's need for dominance kept her trapped, living with a man she was both in love with and afraid of.
At the time, I thought I was in love with him. I thought he'd change. He kept reassuring me he'd change every time and he'd stop. And yeah, I stayed with him. Stupidly stayed with him.
Katie says she suffered psychological and sexual abuse for the next 2 years in what now seems familiar behaviour from Huntley.
I went to get out of the bath and he grabbed my foot and I fell and hit my head. And then he just pinned me down and raped me. There was one time where I'd burnt his dinner and he said I was useless, I couldn't get anything right. He said to me that I'm making him eat that rubbish and tried to feed him cat food. He forced my head into it, tried to get it in my mouth.
Huntley cut Katie's hair in a fit of jealous rage.
He just said it'd suit me, stop boys from looking at me. Each assault was different, each assault was varied in different amounts of time.
And in the midst of the abuse, there was another shock.
I rang my mum, told her that I thought I was pregnant. I was working at the time, so she came and picked me up from work before I was supposed to finish because Ian would make sure he was outside my work every day.
The pregnancy test was positive.
I just cried, and I begged her to come home. And she says, I can't.
I thought it would bring us closer. He went into stages where he was really quiet, wouldn't talk to me, and then he'd start getting angry again.
Katie says Huntley attacked her when she was 3 months pregnant.
I think I must have said something to him in a wrong way. He punched me in my stomach, sexually assaulted me, and then after he'd finished, he threw me down the stairs. I thought to myself, that's it, I've got to protect my baby because he is going to end up killing her.
Katie immediately called her mother for help.
I jumped out the car, went in the house, and as he was shutting the door, I barged him, I jumped on top of him and I beat the shit out of him.
I felt relief when my mum came up the stairs. I knew that I was safe.
Jackie and Katie left Huntley's flat, but not before they were confronted by him one last time.
He turned around to me, and as I was in the car, he says, bye, sweetheart, see you tomorrow. I said, over my dead body. He said, that can be arranged.
5 years later, Ian Huntley was convicted for the Soham murders, but it would be another decade before his baby, by now a teenager, would discover the truth about her biological father.
I found out through school. We was doing the crime rates in Grimsby and Cleethorpes, and so that's all I put into Google, and the picture of my mum came up. So I clicked on it, which took me straight to the story.
The discovery was a terrible shock.
I was extremely upset. I didn't really know what to think. I wasn't angry at my mum for not telling me what he'd done, because at that age I wouldn't want my children to know that. It was getting to me that much that I had to tell my mum. what I'd seen and what I'd read.
I sat her down and talked to her, and that's when she told us what she'd found, and I was heartbroken.
Katie says she'd originally decided to keep the true identity of her daughter's father a secret.
They wouldn't tell her who her biological father was.
I'd never planned on telling Sammy about Ian, but obviously Ian went on to do what he did. So yeah, we realised we had to tell the truth.
She'd tried to tell Samantha part of the story a few years earlier.
When my mum first told me, I was 11. What she said to me was, here's the situation, you've got two daddies. I remember her saying that he was a nasty man and that I'd never see him. I was always curious about it. I always wondered what more there was to that, but I was scared to find out.
Then just before her 18th birthday, Katie gave Samantha a box which contained everything she needed to know.
We give her a box of clippings, what we'd saved up of the whole story.
Yeah, I remember you giving me the box and the clippings.
I wanted to keep everything for you to read and to show what they went through. Holly's parents went through. I mean, you can't even imagine at all. I was one of the lucky ones, really. This one's the story that I did in the paper of what I went through with Ian and what he put me through.
Yeah, I remember you left me alone for a little bit just to have a read through. It took me a while to read because I was crying that much.
I was worried you wouldn't cope. I was worried how it'd affect you, but you've been so strong. I'm so proud of you, the way you've dealt with it.
Even though painful memories of Huntley persist, Katie says she's always seen her daughter as any loving mother would.
Right, here we have, surprise, surprise, your pregnancy test.
Yeah, I remember taking the test.
Sat on my bed, weren't we?
Sat on your bed. The longest 2 minutes of my life. And the best.
But the way in which Samantha found out still weighs on Katie's mind.
Do you think that I did the right thing?
Yeah. I think you did do the right thing by not telling me everything straight away, because it would have been a lot harder for me to process. And it probably, at 11, it would have confused me, and it made me realise just how brave and strong you are and how much I admire you as a person. And it makes me proud to be your daughter.
Samantha now has answers. Katie's moved on, but the disgust they feel for Ian Huntley will never go away.
He's a coward, yeah. He's all right bullying little girls about. When it comes to big people, he's a coward.
Part of me thinks he deserves everything he gets, and that hopefully somebody would do a good job on him. But then I think that's the easy way out. He should rot in jail.
If he was expecting to get some sort of message from me, he'd be lucky to get one. He doesn't even deserve to be known or called my biological father, and he will never deserve to be called Dad.
All these years on, I feel at peace now because we've come through a hellish nightmare, and I hope it's hell for him for the rest of his days.
The family do their best to put the past behind them, but for others, the loopholes and failures that allowed Ian Huntley to slip through the net remain an unforgivable scandal to this day.
If there's one good thing that's come out of this case is that there is the There are greater checks and balances on who gets jobs close to children now. It was criminal in some ways that there should have been such a low threshold of security checks.
Ian Huntley had been given 2 life sentences for the murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. He was behind bars, but the public still demanded to know how he'd been able to go unnoticed and unpunished for so long. What finally emerged were a huge number of errors, loopholes, and missed opportunities, which allowed Huntley to slip through the net.
I think it was a time bomb just ready to go off. And unfortunately, our girls were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
As soon as Huntley was jailed, key questions began to be asked. How had he previously been able to groom underage girls? Why was he not already behind bars? How could he ever be employed as a school caretaker?
When you've got not 1, not 2, not 3, but you've got 5 instances where this man is involved in inappropriate sexual action, how in God's name did that not get passed on to the relevant authority?
The authorities in Humberside knew a lot about Ian Huntley. There'd been a series of allegations of burglary, indecent assault, underage sex and rape before he moved to Soham.
Huntley walked away from Humberside with no criminal convictions, so he was like Teflon Man. Nothing ever stuck to him.
Emma Fish, the 15-year-old schoolgirl who'd been sleeping and living with Huntley, remembers social services paying a visit.
They came to the house once, so I'd already been with him for a while. They had a little chat with me, asked if we were sleeping together. I had to say no. Obviously, I already had words put into my mouth by Ian. I had a separate bedroom set up, the spare room, so they made out that that was my bedroom when the social services came round.
The girls would not comply with the investigation because they were very much under his spell. And often they'd come away saying, well, you know, there doesn't seem to be a risk here. So he would get away with it, essentially.
Other claims involving underage girls were made, and the police were involved. Social services were later criticised for not linking cases together.
If I'd have been the only one, yeah, you could understand how that had slipped through the net, but I wasn't.
Sir Christopher Kelly conducted the serious case review, which investigated what happened when Huntley lived in and around Grimsby.
It was said at the time we did our review that it was well known that Ian Huntley was preying on young girls, particularly since 5 of the 7 went to the same school. There were plenty of examples of poor practice, but those examples don't happen in isolation.
The savagery of Huntley's behaviour is harrowing. Hayley Giblin gave this interview in 2003. She claimed that in 1997, when she was aged 11, Huntley indecently assaulted her in his orchard.
I leant over the fence and started screaming and shouting. Nobody could hurt me, and he put his hands around my waist to pull me down. And he said, we can do this the easy way or the hard way.
Hayley claimed Huntley threatened to kill her if she reported him. She was too terrified to inform police until months later, and was then told there was not enough evidence to prosecute. 10 years later, in prison, Huntley finally confessed.
At the end of the day, if the police or the CPS had believed me, then that Holly and Jessica would still be alive today.
In 1998, Huntley was even charged with raping a woman on this cycle path after she left a nightclub. But the case was dropped after prosecutors thought there was no chance of a conviction.
There were many allegations of rape made against Huntley and abuse as well. But often the Crown Prosecution Service didn't have enough evidence to take these cases forward. Often Huntley would claim the victim role for himself.
Huntley wasn't simply accused of sex crimes. In late 1995, he was a neighbour to Lee Brennan Wood when she was burgled.
In the throes of me coming and going from the house, he actually said,
is there a problem? And I said, yeah, I've been burgled. He said, you've been burgled, have you? And it was going through my mind then, I have been burgled and I'm pretty sure it's you that's burgled me.
Huntley was charged, along with another suspect, but again, it didn't lead to a conviction.
Had he just been convicted of my burglary, it would have stopped all that. It wouldn't have gone any further.
You had a man who still had an outstanding burglary investigation against his name when he was employed as the caretaker in charge of security at the school.
So why wasn't that a red flag? Why weren't the sexual allegations against him a major warning? Part of the problem was that with no convictions, he passed the standard vetting process.
One of the reasons that the alarm bells didn't go off when Huntley applied for his job as a caretaker was that there really wasn't anything to find. So various allegations had been made against him, various things had made their way into the criminal justice process, but nothing had come out the other end. There was no conviction, there was no record. So unless people were to dig very, very deep indeed, they probably wouldn't have found anything.
And yet there were major failings in the vetting system. Information wasn't passed between police forces. Files were deleted. Databases weren't available. And when he applied for the Soham caretaker's job, Huntley used an alias, Ian Nixon.
It was criminal in some ways that there should have been such a low threshold of security checks that would have allowed someone like Huntley close to children in the first place, when it was down to police forces not actually exchanging and transferring information.
Howard Gilbert was the school principal who employed Huntley.
I'm speechless, it's incredulous, because you do a police check and you send it off and you get back no trace and you trust that comment. You think that gives you security in the history of the person. But clearly in this case, that's not been the result.
The information that he had against his name in Humberside in terms of his arrests and suspicions of what he was like and what he was doing should have been available to anybody who wants to employ him to work with vulnerable people such as children as a school caretaker.
And yet it also emerged that the school had not checked Huntley's references. The issues became the subject of the Bichard inquiry.
If tough questions are needed, then I will ask the tough questions. And I said that if criticism was needed, then I wouldn't shirk from making criticism, whether it's of individuals or organisations. This is too important a case not to do that.
The findings were damning. Virtually no organisation escaped blame. Some of the most damning criticism was aimed at Humberside Police and Chief Constable David Westwood.
I've concluded, therefore, that there were serious failings in the senior management of Humberside Police and that the current Chief Constable must take personal as well as corporate responsibility for not identifying and dealing with those earlier.
Westwood was suspended by the Home Secretary and later retired early.
It seemed that a lack of joined-up thinking in our bureaucracy and in our police forces allowed him to slip through unnoticed.
So 15 years on, what lessons have been learned? Has Soham moved on? And what of the people whose lives have been devastated by the killer who betrayed everyone's trust? The murders of Soham schoolgirls Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman in 2002 shocked, then sickened a watching nation.
Somehow the killing of children and the abuse of children always seems way, way worse to most people than an adult-on-adult killing. This is probably as bad a cold-blooded killer as we've seen in modern times.
Betrayal of trust, I think, is what aggravates this offence. Children look at this caretaker at their school as somebody in a position of authority, somebody to look up to an adult that is there to help them, and that they need to trust to help them. By betraying that, he's showed what a callous man he is.
Huntley's crimes are just as repulsive now as they were 15 years ago.
Nobody will ever forget Ian Huntley, and nobody will ever forget Jessica and Holly. It's burned into the national consciousness.
The fact that he went on the hunt, the fact that he would say to the local media he tried to be a good guy, if you look at it at that, if you look at it as sheer heartlessness, then this man is very, very much at the top of the league, if not at the very top of the league.
Holly and Jessica's families said they wanted Huntley to spend his whole life behind bars. The judge at Huntley's trial said he couldn't join the ranks of killers locked up forever because the crime may not have been premeditated. Despite that, it's unlikely he'll ever be freed and is serving a minimum of 40 years. Ian Huntley is in Franklin Prison in County Durham. He's been attacked by fellow inmates, including having his neck slashed.
Some things are beyond the pale, even for the most hardened thief or robber. The crimes like Ian Huntley committed are something that they won't tolerate, and they will try and do something about.
Huntley's reported to have tried to kill himself several times.
I'm not surprised whatsoever that Huntley has tried to take his own life, because that is the ultimate form of control. When you're in prison, you have control over very few things. Other people decide what you eat, when you go to bed, when you wake up. The one thing that you have got control over is your life and your death. And if you can find a way to try and take your own life, some people will do that, and Huntley is one of those people.
Perhaps the most bizarre twist in Huntley's story post-conviction were newspaper reports earlier this year alleging he hopes to have gender reassignment in order to transfer to a women's prison.
I wouldn't even want to investigate whether Ian Huntley wants a sex change or not, but I will go on his past track record. He's lied before. In previous relationships, he used to pretend that he had mental health issues. He's dribbled before in court. He's dribbled before when he's picked up the police. He's tried to pretend that he's almost like a zombie. Why should we believe a bloody word this man says?
The murders of Holly and Jessica are among those cases which will never be forgotten or forgiven. And ultimately they did lead to change aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Was it enough?
There are greater checks and balances on who gets jobs close to children now. So maybe Soham was a watershed moment when it came to giving greater protection to our kids when they're in school.
The Police National Database means police forces are now able to check and pass information more easily.
We are now much more aware of the need to share information, to retain information about people, which can be taken into account if they want to put themselves in a position where they might be able to abuse vulnerable people and children.
While Huntley is unlikely ever to be released, the woman who gave him an alibi in Soham was freed less than 2 years after Holly and Jessica were killed and given a new identity, a lifetime of anonymity.
She was a victim of Ian Huntley, but she wasn't cast as a victim. She was cast as his monstrous mutant collaborator. She was cast as the witch. I think people called her a witch. They certainly called her Myra Hindley Mark II.
The infamous house Maxine Carr shared with Ian Huntley was demolished. Destroying bricks and mortar is easy enough, but overcoming psychological scars, much more difficult.
Ian Huntley absolutely betrayed the community he worked for. He got that job as a caretaker. He was working with kids. He was around kids. He then killed 2 children, totally betraying the school and the community.
In the long term, that the local institutions really have kind of brought that community together. So the church, community organisations, local government, I think all of those individuals have played a role in really making Soham the strong place that it is today.
The townspeople who came together 15 years ago to first help in the search and then grieve for their loss have refused to let the past define their future.
That their children have grown up and that nothing else really terrible has happened in that community will be really helpful and will help many members of the community to feel like this event is in the past. But of course, what the community goes through as a whole now, today, 15 years on, is different to what the parents are experiencing.
Holly and Jessica should now both be 25. Ian Huntley robbed them of their futures. For the Wells and Chapman families, the void left by the loss of their daughters can never be filled.
Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman's pictures were so iconic as, you know, the ultimate little girls who'd done no harm to anybody, who would have been everybody's perfect daughter that nobody would have wanted any harm to come to. Just was an image I don't think people could get out of their minds.
It's crucially important that when we're talking about the Soham murders, that we make this the Holly and Jessica case rather than the Huntley case, because when we brand a particular crime with the name of the offender, I think we attach far too much importance to them. They're not the ones that we should be remembering here. It's Holly and Jessica, and it's their families.
Our memories, now shared with the nation's hearts. Small crumbs of comfort, now it is time to part. We will never forget you, our beautiful Soham Rose.